Alexander ALEKHINE by Ken Neat.
Alexander ALEKHINE was the greatest chess player of all time. That, at least, is my opinion. Some players, for instance Capablanca, may have had greater natural talent, while others, such as Nimzowitsch, may have made more of a lasting impression on the theory of the game. But no one can approach ALEKHINE when we talk about what is most important in a chess player, and that is his success at the board and the style in which he achieves it. ALEKHINE was champion of the world from 1927 until his death in 1946, apart from a 2-year period from 1935 to 37. In a career spanning almost 4 decades, he took first place in a high proportion of the tournaments in which he competed. And in a period during the early 1930s, he was so much superior to his contemporaries that whenever he took part in a tournament, it was virtually accepted beforehand that he would take first place. And yet it will be not so much for his results as for the beauty of his games that ALEKHINE will be remembered. I will be discussing his style of play later on. It will be sufficient to say here that many of ALEKHINE's masterpieces will be as admired as long as chess is being played. And yet, if you ask the opinions of present-day chess players as to who have been the greatest players of all time, you may find that ALEKHINE does not figure even among their top 10. Why should this be? I feel that such critics must be influenced not by the man's results and style of play, but more by the deficiencies of character which displayed themselves during his stormy life. For this reason, I think it is important that I should give here a short biography of ALEKHINE. He was born in Moscow on the 19th of October 1892 into a wealthy Russian family. He learned to play chess when he was 7 years old and began taking it seriously from the age of 12. In his early teens, he played a good deal of correspondence chess and began playing in over-the-board tournaments only at the age of 15. He entered a special school to study law, but at the same time was able to develop his talent for chess, and by the age of 16 he was a recognized master. So it can be seen that he was by no means a child prodigy, like Capablanca, for instance. He had a considerable talent for chess, of course, but a great deal of hard work was required for him to reach the great heights. Successful appearances in other events led to his participation in the great St. Petersburg tournament of 1914. This was won by the world champion, Lasker, with Capablanca in second place, while ALEKHINE created a stir by finishing third, ahead of such illustrious names as Tarrasch, Marshall, Bernstein, Rubinstein, Nimzowitsch, Blackburn, and Janowski. Shortly after this, he was leading in another very strong tournament in Mannheim, when the First World War broke out. Along with other foreign players, he was interned, but succeeded in escaping, and on reaching home volunteered for the front, where he served in a medical corps. He was wounded, decorated for bravery, and then he returned to Moscow, where in 1917 the Bolsheviks seized power in the Great October Revolution. Little is known about his life at the time of the revolution and during the terrible years of the Civil War, but he did take part in and win the so-called All-Russian Chess Olympiad in Moscow in 1920, now recognized as the first USSR championship. following year, ALEKHINE married and left Russia with his wife, never to return. He settled in Paris and eventually became a naturalized French citizen. Why did he leave Russia? Well, there is no sure answer to this question, but as a member of the aristocracy, he must have had a pretty rough time of it during and after the revolution. And perhaps he thought that there would be little time for chess in a country with such great social upheavals taking place. But, as it happens, of course, chess was greatly encouraged in the Soviet Union during the 1920s and 1930s, as it was seen as a means of raising the cultural level of the masses. When ALEKHINE reached the West in 1921, 7 years had passed since the Mannheim tournament. Of course, he had been able to play some chess in the intervening years, but even so, no international tournaments from the age of 21 to 28 was quite a large portion of a chess player's life. And in the next few years, he certainly did his best to make up for this, competing in several international tournaments, generally with great success. At the same time, he continued his studies, and in 1925 was awarded his doctorate in law. Hence the Dr. ALEKHINE, by which he is generally known. Capablanca had won the world title from Lasker in 1921, and in the next few years, ALEKHINE established himself as the #1 challenger. Even so, on the few occasions when he competed against Capablanca, ALEKHINE generally had to play second fiddle. And when the match between them was eventually arranged to be played in Buenos Aires in 1927, there were few who predicted that ALEKHINE would win. But he prepared himself very thoroughly for the match, and in a titanic struggle lasting over 2 months, he eventually came out on top by 6 wins to 3, with 25 games drawn. It is unfortunate that, after this, relations between these two great players, who had once been friends, grew steadily worse, and the return match was never held. Instead, ALEKHINE kept himself busy playing frequently in tournaments, and in the next few years produced some of his finest chess. Among his many successes during this time were his 2 great victories at Saint-Remo in 1930 and at Bled in 1931, in each of which he finished streets ahead of a world-class field. In 1929, and again in 1934, he was twice challenged by Bogolyubov for the World Championship, but on each occasion ALEKHINE won by a convincing margin. ALEKHINE was a very busy world champion. In addition to his tournament and match appearances, he also gave numerous simultaneous displays, including blindfold ones. Perhaps it was the strain of these which began to leave its mark, but at any rate he began turning to drink. And when he came to defend his title against Dr. Erve in 1935, he was possibly not at his best, and he lost the match by the narrowest possible margin. Following this, ALEKHINE's play seemed to deteriorate, and it might have been expected that the best had now been seen of him. But Erve very sportingly agreed to a return match 2 years later, and for this ALEKHINE made a great effort to curb his drinking, and as a result arrived much better prepared. He was able to recapture his former brilliant form, and he won a most convincing victory to regain his title. Following this, there were negotiations for him to defend his title against Flor or Botvinnik. But in 1939, when ALEKHINE was captaining the French team at the Buenos Aires Olympiad, the Second World War broke out. It would have been more prudent for him to have stayed on in Argentina, as several other European players did. But instead, he took the first available boat to France and joined the French army as an interpreter. It is here that we come to the most unfortunate part of ALEKHINE's biography. He fell into the hands of the Nazis, who realized that the world champion could be of considerable propaganda value to them. 2 articles, strongly pro-Nazi and anti-Jewish in content, allegedly written by ALEKHINE, appeared in the German press and caused widespread offence in the free world. ALEKHINE and his wife were directed to take up residence in Prague, from where he took part in several tournaments in occupied Europe from 1941 to 43. Suggestions that he lived well during these years, at the expense of the Nazis, do not tally with the accounts of eyewitnesses, who describe a mere shadow of a man compared with the former proud world champion. In 1943, with the tide beginning to turn against the Nazis, ALEKHINE managed to get away from Prague to Spain, and then on to Portugal, where he had a few friends. When the war ended, he tried to return to France, but was unable to obtain a visa. Living in poverty and loneliness in a Lisbon boarding house, ALEKHINE's health was gradually deteriorating when he received an invitation to the London tournament held in December 1945. But objections to ALEKHINE's participation, in particular by the Americans, on account of his alleged pro-Nazi activities during the war, caused the invitation to be withdrawn. ALEKHINE was not given the chance to defend himself. A few months later, in 1946, the British Chess Federation agreed to sponsor a match for the World Championship between ALEKHINE and Botvinnik. But shortly after this, before the match could take place, ALEKHINE died in his lonely room. A very sad end for such a great player. But at least, I would like to think that, with the match against Botvinnik in prospect, his last few days were happy ones. I'd now like to return to ALEKHINE's early years and to examine some of his games in an effort to discover just what was special about his play. On the whole, I've tried to avoid giving some of his best-known games, as these are frequently quoted in books as examples of attacking technique or of combinational brilliance. You can, of course, simply play through these games for enjoyment, but if you wish to improve your play, and who doesn't, then I suggest that you switch off your cassette when I tell you to, then study the position, and decide what you would have played. I first came across the name of ALEKHINE in that very fine book by Reti, Modern Ideas in Chess, which I think is still very much worth reading. It contains a highly perceptive comment on the play of the young ALEKHINE, which I would like to quote. In general, in a combination, the first surprising and beautiful move is the sacrifice. With ALEKHINE, it is mostly the final move that takes his opponent's breath away. He beats his opponents by analysing simple and apparently harmless sequences of moves, in order to see whether, at some time or another at the end of it, an original possibility, and therefore one difficult to see, might be hidden. The following game, which ALEKHINE played when he was 17 years old, is an example of what Reti had in mind. It was played in the international tournament at Hamburg in 1910, and ALEKHINE had white against F.D. Yates, the British champion-to-be, who was also just commencing his international chess career. In subsequent encounters, ALEKHINE was often to find Yates more than a handful. The one game that I particularly recall is Yates's wonderful win at Carlsbad in 1923. But on this occasion, it is ALEKHINE who comes out on top. The game began quietly enough as a Queen's Gambit declined. 1. Pawn to Queen 4. Pawn to Queen 4 by black. 2. Pawn to Queen Bishop 4. Pawn to King 3. 3. Knight to Queen's Bishop 3. Knight to King's Bishop 3. 4. Bishop to Knight 5. Bishop to King 2. 5. Knight to Bishop 3. Queen Knight to Queen 2. 6. Pawn to King 3. Castles. And now 7. Queen to Bishop 2. With this rather unusual move, ALEKHINE displays his aggressive intentions. One idea behind the Queen move, which makes a welcome change from the normal Rook to Bishop 1 followed by Bishop to Queen 3, is to castle queenside and then make a kingside pawn storm. Well now, suppose that someone were to play Queen to Bishop 2 against you in a game. Switch off your cassette, study the position, and decide what you would play now if you were black. If you're a fairly sharp player, you may well have chosen 7 Pawn to Bishop 4, which could lead to a very tense position after 8 castles queenside by white. Or else you may have chosen 7 Pawn to King Rook 3, when white could maintain the tension by offering to sacrifice his bishop by 8 Pawn to King Rook 4. A more solid but rather passive alternative is 7 Pawn to Bishop 3. Yates, in fact, chose 7 Pawn to Queen's Knight 3, which is probably the least promising of the moves we have considered. The point is that, in the event of white castling queenside, the black pawn at Queen Knight 3 is rather in the way of black's pieces, particularly his queen and queen's knight. So go back now to diagram 1 and make for black the move 7 Pawn to Queen Knight 3. ALEKHINE now exchanged pawns with 8 Pawn takes pawn. Black recaptured with his pawn, and white now developed with 9 Bishop to Queen 3, not yet committing his king to either side of the board. After black's reply 9 Bishop to Knight 2, ALEKHINE was afraid that if he castled queenside immediately, black might take advantage of the unprotected position of white's queen's bishop and play 10 Knight to King 5. So to avoid this, ALEKHINE played 10 Pawn to King Rook 4, a move which in any case fits in with the idea of a kingside pawn storm. Black now played the natural 10 Pawn to Bishop 4, whereupon white did castle on the queen side. Now, If black should play 11 pawn to bishop 5, then white continues 12 bishop to bishop 5 with queen's bishop takes knight and pawn to king knight 4 to knight 5 to follow. So instead, black opened up the queen's bishop file by 11 pawn takes pawn. White could have recaptured with his pawn so as to keep a pawn on queen 4, but he preferred to recapture with the knight, so that's 12 king's knight takes pawn. If his kingside pawn storm doesn't prove feasible, then white will still have the possibility of play against black's isolated queen pawn. Also, there is now the inviting square king bishop 5 for the white knight, so black decided to prepare a retreat for his king's bishop at king bishop 1 by playing 12 rook to king 1, although probably an immediate counterattack by pawn to queen rook 3 and pawn to queen knight 4 was more in order. White took advantage of the lull to move his king to a safer square by 13 king to knight 1, and now black did begin his queenside attack by 13 pawn to queen rook 3. Then came 14 pawn to king knight 4, pawn to knight 4 by black, and here we have a rather crucial position which is given in diagram 2, which I suggest that you study, especially since it is here that Retty's comment becomes pertinent. If it's any help to you, ALEKHINE found here a surprising possibility at move 20, and a winning rook sacrifice in one line at move 22. So switch off now, and then return to diagram 2 if you move the pieces around. Well, the next few moves were more or less forced. 15 bishop takes knight, knight takes bishop, 16 pawn to knight 5, knight to king 5, 17 knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, 18 bishop takes king pawn, bishop takes bishop, 19 queen takes bishop, and now to regain his pawn, black played 19 bishop takes pawn, with a discovered attack on the white queen. Did you get this far? If so, how did you intend to continue? If you didn't reach this position, then switch off again and decide what you would play. I suppose that the obvious continuation is 20 queen to knight 4, but then black seems to be able to just about hang on by 20 bishop to rook 3. For instance, 21 knight to bishop 5, queen to bishop 3, 22 rook to queen 6, rook to king 3. Okay, go back now to diagram 3. ALEKHINE evidently wasn't satisfied with this line, for he played here 20 knight to king 6, blocking off the attack on his own queen and discovering one on the enemy queen. Black's reply was virtually forced, queen to king 2, and after 21 pawn takes bishop, white was threatening mate on the move. He is temporarily a piece up but he won't be able to hang on to it, as we will see. Put yourself in Black's shoes this time, and decide how you would meet the mating threat. Did you decide on 21 pawn to knight 3? This looks okay, since 22 queen to king rook 4 can be neatly answered by pawn takes knight, regaining the piece and defending against the mate at king rook 2. But this is where ALEKHINE had foreseen the rook sacrifice as long ago as move 15. He had planned, after 21 pawn to knight 3, to play 22 rook takes pawn, when Black's best is queen takes knight, since king takes rook loses to rook 1 check and queen to king rook 4. After 22 queen takes knight, there comes 23 queen to king rook 4, again threatening mate. Black is forced to reply queen to king 5 check. 24 queen takes queen, rook takes queen, and now 25 rook on queen 1 to rook 1, when the threat of mate again wins white a rook. So there we see Retty's analysis of ALEKHINE's method in practice. Starting with move 15, a simple series of exchanges, and then crash, a complicated forced variation which it was difficult for the opponent to work out beforehand. Now go back to diagram 4. Yates now saw, no doubt, that 21 pawn to knight 3 would lose, so he played 21 pawn to rook 3 and managed to escape into a rook ending a pawn down. The continuation was 22 pawn takes pawn, queen takes knight, 23 queen to queen 4. The point of this move is that white considers that the black rook will be less well placed at king 5 than at king 3. Black was forced to exchange queens by 23 queen to king 5 check, 24 queen takes queen, rook takes queen, and now came 25 pawn takes pawn, king takes pawn. So all ALEKHINE's ingenuity has left him only a pawn up, but the accuracy with which he plays the ending is also worthy of note. He now played 26 queen rook to knight 1 check, king to bishop 3, 27 rook to rook 6 check, king to king 2, 28 rook to queen's bishop 1, rook to rook 2, 29 rook on bishop 1 to bishop 6, pawn to rook 4, 30 rook to rook 6, rook takes rook, 31 rook takes rook, pawn to rook 5, 32 rook to queen knight 6, rook to king 4. Black's last few moves have all been virtually forced, and after tying Black's rook to the defence of his queen-knight pawn, ALEKHINE now brings his king to the centre to support the advance of his kingside pawns. So the game continued. 33, king to bishop 2, rook to queen bishop 4, check. 34, king to queen 3, king to queen 2, 35, pawn to rook 3, rook to bishop 4. Black defends his bishop pawn so as to be able to play king to bishop 2 and so relieve the pressure on his queen-knight pawn. White now played 36, pawn to bishop 4, king to bishop 2, 37, rook to king rook 6, rook to queen 4, check. 38, king to bishop 3, pawn to bishop 4. So, black has managed to prevent the direct advance of white's kingside pawns. But now white wins by a forced manoeuvre. He played 39, rook to king 6, king to queen 2, and now I suggest that you switch off here and try to work out the consequences of the pawn ending, which results after white's 40, rook to king 5. Okay, well, if you've moved the pieces around, perhaps you'd like to go back now to diagram 4a. Well, 40, rook to king 5 is what ALEKHINE played, and after 40, rook takes rook, 41, pawn takes rook, what did you decide was black's best try? 41, king to king 3 loses immediately to 42, king to queen 4. So Yates had to play 41, king to king 2. What should white play now? 42, king to knight 4 only leads to a queen ending with an extra rook pawn for white, while 42, king to queen 4 is no good on account of the reply king to king 3. So ALEKHINE played 42, king to queen 3, and Yates again played the best move, king to queen 2. Then came 43, pawn to king 4, pawn to bishop 5, and now 44, king to king 2. In view of the threat of king to bishop 3, followed by king takes pawn, black's reply was forced. He played king to king 3. White could still lose this ending if he were to play 45, king to bishop 3, but instead he chose 45, king to bishop 2, and black resigned, since after 45, king takes pawn, 46, king to bishop 3, he loses his king's bishop pawn. A very instructive pawn ending, I think you will agree. And now I'd like to show you what I would call a real ALEKHINE game, one which bears his unmistakable stamp. Note the careful preparation, and then the swift, irresistible attack which follows, where everything is calculated with exact precision. played 2 years before ALEKHINE was to become world champion, it's the game ALEKHINE Marshall from the 1925 Baden-Baden tournament. The game began 1 pawn to queen 4, pawn to queen 4 by black, 2 pawn to queen bishop 4, knight to king bishop 3. It's rather typical of Marshall to adopt what was regarded as a slightly inferior opening against such a powerful opponent. White played 3 pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, 4 pawn to king 4. In fact, it isn't so easy to refute black's setup, and it is possible that white should simply play here 4 knight to king bishop 3, but then black can transpose into a Grunfeld by 4 pawn to king knight 3. After white's 4 pawn to king 4, black retreated his knight to king bishop 3, and white defended his king pawn by 5 bishop to queen 3. Now, if you were black, how would you attempt to combat white's formidable-looking pawn centre? Switch off here and study the position. Marshall played 5 pawn to king 4. This is the whole point of his play. ALEKHINE continued 6 pawn takes pawn, to which black replied knight to knight 5. Then came 7 knight to king bishop 3, knight to queen bishop 3, and 8 bishop to king knight 5. The point is that if white tries to hang onto his king pawn by 8 bishop to king bishop 4, then black plays 8 knight to knight 5, and white eventually loses the exchange. Black answered bishop to king knight 5 with bishop to king 2. White exchanged bishops by 9 bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop, 10 knight to bishop 3, queen's knight takes pawn, 11 knight takes knight. And then black made a mistake. Which piece would you have recaptured with? Marshall played 11 queen takes knight, but, as the sequel will show, he should have recaptured with the knight, when white would have had, at best, a minimal advantage. ALEKHINE now played 12 pawn to king rook 3, forcing the retreat knight to bishop 3. And this time, put yourself in white's shoes and decide, what would you have played now? This position is given in diagram 5. White's plan here was to mobilize his kingside pawn mass, spearheaded by the king pawn, so as to storm black's kingside. With this end in view, he wishes, first of all, to avoid castling kingside himself, since then the projected pawn advance may leave his own king endangered. And secondly, ALEKHINE played with a finish king to queen 2. time, the queen is strongly posted at king 3 to assist the king-side pawn advance. Marshall now played 14 bishop to bishop 3, and this was perhaps already the fatal mistake. His last chance to bring his king into comparative safety was by queen to queen rook 4, followed by castling queenside. After black's 14 bishop to bishop 3, ALEKHINE now played 15 castles queenside, and black replied by castling on the king side. Now, after the careful preparations, comes a series of hammer blows which leave the black position in ruins. 16 pawn to bishop 4. Now, where should black move his queen to? Black in fact retreated it to king 3. 16 queen to queen rook 4 looks like a more active defence, but then comes 17 pawn to king 5, knight to queen 4, 18 knight takes knight, bishop takes knight, 19 bishop takes pawn check, king takes bishop, 20 queen to queen 3 check, and 21 queen takes bishop, when white wins a pawn. OK, now go back to diagram 6. After black's 16 queen to king 3, white pushed on with 17 pawn to king 5. Then came 17 king rook to king 1, 18 king rook to king 1, and black also centralised his other rook with 18 queen rook to queen 1. In fact, it would have been slightly better to play 18 knight to queen 2, when white would probably have continued his attack by pawn to king knight 4. Now, however, white gains a virtually won position by a forced series of moves. 19 pawn to bishop 5, queen to king 2, 20 queen to knight 5, knight to queen 4, 21 pawn to bishop 6, queen to bishop 1. White certainly has a very imposing position, but how would you continue the attack? Switch off and consider the position. ALEKHINE in fact played 22 bishop to bishop 4. It turns out that the bishop will be more effective on this new diagonal than on the queen knight 1 to king rook 7 diagonal. Marshall played 22 knight takes knight. Note that 22 pawn to king rook 3 would have lost a piece to 23 pawn takes pawn. After 22 knight takes knight, there came 23 rook takes rook. Rook takes rook by black. And now stop the cassette again and decide how you would have continued the attack. ALEKHINE played 24 pawn takes pawn which is more convincing than other slower moves, which would allow black something of a respite if he could get in pawn to king rook 3. If you've moved the pieces around, go back now to diagram 7 and play 24 pawn takes pawn for white. If black plays here 24 queen to king 1, then white wins by 25 bishop takes pawn check. Since if black takes the bishop with his queen, he loses his rook at queen 1, while if after 25 bishop takes pawn check he captures the bishop with his king, then white wins by 26 rook to bishop 1 check, king to king 3, 27 rook to bishop 6 check, king to queen 4, and now 28 rook to bishop 8. Okay, let's now go back to the game. To get the correct position, return again to diagram 7 and make the move for white 24 pawn takes pawn. Black actually played knight takes pawn check. How would you now continue if you were white? ALEKHINE in fact played 25 king to knight 1. Note that after 25 bishop takes knight, black could have gained the breathing space by queen to bishop 4 check. After 25 king to knight 1, black was forced to play queen to king 1 when ALEKHINE advanced 26 pawn to king 6. As we saw in the last note, bishop takes pawn check would also have won, but pawn to king 6 is even stronger. Black now played bishop to king 5 check, and ALEKHINE replied 27 king to rook 1. Rook takes bishop is also possible, but ALEKHINE's move is somehow cleaner. Now black saw that if he played 27 pawn takes pawn, then white has 28 bishop takes pawn check, queen takes bishop, 29 queen takes rook check, king takes pawn, 30 queen to queen 4 check, followed by 31 rook takes bishop with an easy win. Okay, go back now to diagram 8. Marshall therefore played 27 pawn to king bishop 4, but this lost even more quickly after 28 pawn to king 7 discovered check, rook to queen 4, 29 queen to bishop 6, queen to bishop 2, and then white promoted his king pawn to a queen, calling check. This in fact forces mate in 2 moves. After queen takes queen, bishop takes rook check, and so black resigned. ALEKHINE had to display more than mere tactical brilliance to defeat Capablanca in their match for the World Championship in 1927. Here he played several powerful games where tactical precision was linked to deep and sound strategy. His bombshell win in the first game of the match with the black pieces is a good example. The game was a French defence and began 1. Pawn to king 4, pawn to king 3, 2. Pawn to queen 4, pawn to queen 4, 3. Knight to queen's bishop 3, bishop to knight 5, and now Capablanca characteristically played the simplifying move 4. Pawn takes pawn. Nowadays, white normally plays this only if he is thinking in terms of a draw. The present game shows that, even if your name is Capablanca, it isn't as easy as all that to draw. Black replied, pawn takes pawn, and then the players developed by 5. Bishop to queen 3, knight to queen's bishop 3, 6. King's knight to king 2, king's knight to king 2 by black, 7. Castles, bishop to king bishop 4. In this way, black exchanges off white's good bishop, and white played 8. Bishop takes bishop, knight takes bishop, 9. Queen to queen 3, queen to queen 2, and now 10. Knight to queen 1. It's a sign that all is not quite right with white's position if he has to resort to a manoeuvre like this. Even so, the position isn't sharp enough for such a loss of time to be really significant. Black continued his development by castling on the king side. When white played 11. Knight to king 3, which is the point of his previous move, then came knight takes knight, 12. Bishop takes knight, king rook to king 1 by black. And now white made a series of slightly inferior moves. First of all, he played 13. Knight to bishop 4, whereas probably bishop to bishop 4 followed by pawn to queen bishop 3 would have been better. Black replied 13. Bishop to queen 3, inviting white to play 14. Knight takes pawn, when black replies bishop takes pawn check, followed by queen takes knight, which is definitely in his favour. So instead, white played 14. King rook to king 1, so as to contest the open king file. But pawn to queen bishop 3, preventing knight to knight 5, would have been better. So after white's 14. King rook to king 1, black in fact played 14. Knight to knight 5, and white played his queen to knight 3. And this is another slight error. Here it would have been better to have retreated it to queen 2. Anyway, after white's 15. Queen to knight 3, black played queen to bishop 4. Note that all his moves so far have been perfectly natural ones. White now played 16 queen rook to bishop 1, and this was a definite blunder, although his position was by now rather difficult. Instead of this, his best chance was to allow the doubling of his pawns after 16 knight to queen 3. Knight takes knight, 17 queen takes knight, queen takes queen, 18 pawn takes queen, when the ending is in black's favour. White has made several inaccurate moves, so go back now to diagram 9, play for white 16 queen rook to bishop 1, and then switch off and see how you would have continued. ALEKHINE played 16 knight takes bishop's pawn. Did you spot this? After the reply 17 rook takes knight, how did you plan to continue? No marks for bishop takes knight, since white plays 18 rook to bishop 5 and regains his pawn. But full marks instead for 17 queen takes knight, which is what ALEKHINE played. Black again exploits the fact that the bishop on the king file is pinned, but he also threatens queen takes rook pawn check. So white was forced to play 18 pawn to knight 3, when black retreated his queen to bishop 4, again attacking the white rook, so that white has no time to take the queen knight pawn, and black remains a pawn up with the better position. The game continued, 19 rook on bishop 2 to king 2, pawn to queen knight 3, 20 queen to knight 5, pawn to king rook 4. This is a characteristic ALEKHINE move, making an escape square for his king and threatening to exploit white's weakened king side by pawn to rook 5. So white blocked the further advance of the pawn by 21 pawn to king rook 4, when ALEKHINE replied rook to king 5, and this threatens rook takes rook's pawn with a mating attack. Capablanca found a clever defence. He gave up a second pawn by 22 bishop to queen 2, the point of which will soon be clear. The game continued, 22 rook takes queen pawn, 23 bishop to bishop 3, rook to queen 6, 24 bishop to king 5, rook to queen 1, 25 bishop takes bishop, rook takes bishop, 26 rook to king 5, queen to bishop 6, and now 27 rook takes rook's pawn. White is still a pawn down, but his pieces now have a lot of scope, and black has to play very carefully. What would you have played now? White is threatening mate, and what black shouldn't play is 27 rook to king 3, since he still gets mated after 28 queen to king 8 check. OK, if you've moved the pieces about, go back now to diagram 10. ALEKHINE played 27 queen takes rook, allowing white to play 28 rook to king 8 check, king to rook 2, 29 queen takes rook check, queen to knight 3, 30 queen to queen 1, when another important moment in the game was reached. So switch off now and decide what you would have played now as black. Black saw that pawn to queen 5 could be answered by 31 queen to bishop 3, when white has the awkward threats of queen to rook 8 or pawn to rook 5, and so black made an instructive decision. He decided to return his extra pawn so as to regain the freedom and coordination of his pieces, which have been lacking since white's pawn sacrifice. So go back now to diagram 11. So black played 30 rook to king 3, when the queen ending is lost for white if he exchanges rooks, and so he attacked a second black pawn by 31 rook to queen rook 8. Black now made another instructive move. He played rook to king 4, so as to then place his queen behind his rook on the open file. You will find that this is almost invariably the correct formation. White re-established material equality by 32 rook takes pawn, but then came pawn to queen bishop 4, 33 rook to queen 7, here 33 king to knight 2 might in fact have held out a bit longer. Black answered rook to queen 7 with queen to king 3, and then came 34 queen to queen 3 check, pawn to knight 3, 35 rook to queen 8, pawn to queen 5, 36 pawn to rook 4. White has managed to stop the passed queen pawn, but his queen and rook are otherwise completely uncoordinated. Switch off now and decide how you would have finished the game. ALEKHINE himself pointed out that he missed an easy win here by 36 queen to king 2, threatening the rook, 37 rook to queen knight 8, queen to bishop 2, 38 queen to knight 3, rook to king 3, 39 rook to queen rook 8, queen to bishop 3, when black threatens the rook as well as mate by rook to king 8 check. That would have been the quickest way to win, although ALEKHINE's method is certainly good enough, and in a sense is more logical, for with the white rook out of play, the combined attack of the black queen and rook on the weakened white king position must be decisive. Go back now to diagram 12. ALEKHINE played 36 rook to king 8 check, intrusion of black's heavy pieces was quickly decisive. The game concluded 37 king to knight 2, queen to queen bishop 3 check, 38 pawn to bishop 3, rook to king 6, 39 queen to queen 1, queen to king 3, 40 pawn to king knight 4, rook to king 7 check, 41 king to rook 3, queen to king 6, 42 queen to king rook 1, queen to bishop 5, 43 pawn to king rook 5, and now rook to king bishop 7, when white resigned, since black's threats are now decisive. As I said earlier, ALEKHINE will be best remembered for the beauty of his games. His combinational ability is legendary, and so I am now going to give you the chance to work out for yourself some of his combinations. The 6 examples I have selected are arranged in roughly ascending order of difficulty, and the first one, shown in diagram 13, is taken from the 1927 World Championship match. Capablanca, who is white, has just played his rook to queen 1. By pinning black's knight against his queen, he hopes to avoid losing any material. What has he overlooked? ALEKHINE, as black, played knight takes pawn, and white resigned, since he comes out a piece down after queen takes queen, black rook takes queen, since now pawn takes knight loses to bishop takes pawn check. In diagram 14, white's passed queen pawn appears to be doomed, but on the other hand, his pieces are actively placed. How does he turn this to account? This is a position from a game played in Paris in 1925, when ALEKHINE was white against Cole. ALEKHINE played queen takes rook, the black rook took the queen, white rook to king 8 check, king to rook 2, and now rook on bishop 1 to bishop 8. And after black's rook to queen 1, rook on king 8 takes rook, black resigned, since mate can be prevented only by giving up the queen. Note that the combination was possible only thanks to the fact that the black queen blocked her own king's escape square at king knight 4. Now set up diagram 15. White has just played pawn to bishop 3, hoping to undermine the black knight's position. How does black take advantage of the weakening effect of this move? ALEKHINE, who was playing black against Grunfeld at Karlsbad in 1923, played rook takes knight. If now pawn takes rook, then black plays bishop takes pawn check, and after the forced king to bishop 1, he continues knight to bishop 5, attacking the white queen. If the queen moves to queen 2, then black wins by queen to bishop 5 check, king to king 1, and now pawn to king 6. Right, now replace white's king at king bishop 1, his queen at king 2, black's queen at queen bishop 1, and the black pawn at king 5. If, instead of playing his queen to queen 2, white chooses queen takes king pawn, then black plays queen to bishop 5 check, king to king 1, knight takes pawn check, king to queen 2, and now bishop to king 6 check, which wins lots of material. Please go back now to diagram 15. Switch off your cassette if necessary to set up this position. After black's first move, rook takes knight, white didn't in fact capture the rook, but played pawn takes pawn when there are 2 black pieces on prise. Did you consider this possibility? If not, please switch off again and decide how you would have continued. ALEKHINE played knight to bishop 5, forcing the reply pawn takes knight. And then came the killer move, black's queen to bishop 5. Now white loses a piece whatever he does, but in fact he generously allowed black to force mate after queen takes queen, black rook takes rook check, queen to bishop 1, bishop to queen 5 check, and mate next move. Now please set up diagram 16. This is from a game played in 1942 and shows that even at the age of 50, ALEKHINE had lost none of his combinational sparkle. White has just captured black's queen's rook and appears to have more than adequate compensation for his queen. How does black show that this is not true? One possibility is rook takes bishop on king knight 7 check, king takes rook, queen to king 7 check, when black can force a draw by perpetual check. But he has a much more deadly move at his disposal. Please switch off and set up diagram 16 again. ALEKHINE played bishop to rook 6. There are 3 points to this move. Firstly, the bishop evades the attack by the white rook, while keeping the queen bishop 1 square covered. Secondly, it threatens white's king's bishop. And thirdly, it cannot be taken by the white bishop, since after bishop takes bishop, there comes queen to king 6 check, king to rook 1, queen to king to bishop 6 check, king to knight 1, queen to bishop 7 check, and mate next move. So please set up diagram 16 again. After black's first move of bishop to rook 6, Opportunisti, who was playing white, resorted to a desperate sacrifice. He played rook to queen 8 check, queen takes rook, white bishop takes bishop, black queen takes knight. But then he resigned, since even after rook to bishop 8 check, queen takes rook, bishop takes queen, black plays rook takes bishop, with an easily won ending. Now please switch off and set up diagram 17. This, by contrast, is from a game played 30 years earlier, when ALEKHINE was only 20 years old. The position certainly looks right for a combination. The terrible white pawn at king 6 splits black's forces in two, and in addition, hardly any of his pieces are developed. But he has just captured the queen-knight pawn, with a simultaneous attack on white's rook and knight. How does white once again demonstrate that the queen-knight pawn is a poisoned pawn? ALEKHINE played knight to knight 5, offering black the choice of either one knight or two rooks. If he takes the knight, that's pawn takes knight, then he is soon mated after bishop takes pawn check, king to queen 1, rook to queen 1 check, bishop to queen 2, bishop to king 5, and after queen to knight 5 check by black, white plays pawn to bishop 3. Okay, now please switch off again and go back to diagram 17. After white's first move, knight to knight 5, ALEKHINE's opponent, Levenfish, captured the two rooks, but this enabled him to last out only a little longer. He played queen takes rook check, king to bishop 2, queen takes the other rook, but then came knight to bishop 7 check, king to queen 1, queen to queen 2 check, bishop to queen 2, pawn takes bishop, and Levenfish resigned, since knight takes pawn loses immediately to bishop to king 6, while after pawn to king 4 by black, white has a pleasant choice of mating methods. Thus he can force mate with a series of checks by knight to king 6 check, king to king 2, pawn to queen 8, getting a second queen with check, rook takes queen, queen takes rook check, king to bishop 2, knight takes bishop, discovered check, king to knight 2, and now queen to king 7 is mate. The last position I would like you to look at is given in diagram 18. So please switch off and set up this position. This is the scene for one of ALEKHINE's most brilliant combinations. Bogolyubov, who was playing black, had just played his knight from queen bishop 3 to knight 5, discovering an attack on the white rook. One suspects that ALEKHINE's combination must have come as a complete surprise to him. Can you find white's reply and the rather intricate variations which follow? This is a rather difficult one, and I'll be surprised if you manage to find all the possible lines. But switch off now, and at least have a good try. ALEKHINE played bishop to king 4, threatening mate on rook 7, when black has 3 possible defences. If he plays pawn to knight 3, then white plays bishop to bishop 6, threatening mate both by queen to rook 6, as well as by queen takes pawn check, king takes queen, rook to king rook 5 check, etc. Now please replace white's queen at king rook 4, his rook at queen 5, the black king at king knight 1, and the black pawn at rook 2. Black's reply, knight takes rook, is therefore forced. But then comes bishop takes knight, pawn to king rook 4. This is the only move to stop white's queen to rook 6. White bishop to queen bishop 3. Black queen to queen 1. And now white queen to queen 4, when mate cannot be prevented. Please switch off now and set up diagram 18 and play the move bishop to king 4 for white. The second possible defence for black was pawn to king rook 3, when white makes the sacrifice bishop takes pawn. Now pawn takes bishop fails to rook to king knight 5 check. Please replace now white's rook on queen 5, his bishop at king rook 6, and the black pawn at king knight 2. If instead of pawn takes bishop, black plays knight takes rook, then white wins by queen to knight 5, pawn to knight 3, bishop takes knight, which threatens queen to bishop 6, when black's only defence is queen to king bishop 4. But this allows queen takes queen, pawn takes queen, bishop takes bishop, and white comes out a piece ahead. Now replace the pieces as follows, please. White's queen at king rook 4, his rook at queen 5, his bishop at king 4, black's queen at queen bishop 1, his bishop at queen knight 2, his knight at queen knight 5, and his king knight pawn, which is now on king bishop 4, should be at king knight 2. Black's only other alternative here is pawn to bishop 4, which white answers by queen to knight 5. And there are two possible defences against the threatened mate at king knight 7. Black can play queen to bishop 2, but then comes bishop takes knight pawn, queen takes bishop, queen takes queen check, king takes queen, rook to queen 7 check, followed by bishop takes bishop, and white is 2 pawns up with an easy win in the endgame. So now replace white's queen at king knight 5, his rook at queen 5, and his bishops at king 4 and king rook 6. Black's king is at king knight 1, his queen is at queen bishop 1, his bishop at queen knight 2, and he has a pawn at king knight 2. The other possible defense is rook to bishop 2. When white continues rook takes pawn, black plays bishop takes bishop. Now white rook takes rook, king takes rook, queen takes pawn check, king to king 3, and now rook to queen 1. When white, who already has 3 pawns for his sacrificed piece, also has a winning attack against the exposed black king. I leave you to work this out for yourself. Bogolyubov in fact chose the third possible defense, so please switch off now and go back to diagram 18. After white's bishop to king 4, black played pawn to bishop 4, which ALEKHINE answered with a simple bishop takes pawn, rook takes bishop, rook to queen 8 check, queen takes rook, bishop takes queen, when, with queen and pawn against rook and knight, white had a decisive material advantage. Black played on for another 11 moves, but his position was already hopeless. I hope that this brief selection of games and combinations by ALEKHINE may have whetted your appetite for more. I should also say that ALEKHINE is recognized as one of the finest of chess annotators, and I strongly recommend you to read some of the excellent books written by him. Pride of place must go to the 2 books of his own collected games from 1908 to 23 and from 1924 to 37. He also wrote the annotations for several tournament books, and perhaps the best known of these is the book of the 1924 International Tournament in New York. Finally, if you would like to read more about ALEKHINE's stormy life, I suggest that you read the rather controversial biography by Alexander Kotov, which I translated from the Russian. This book also contains 75 of ALEKHINE's best games, which Kotov annotates from a modern-day point of view.